We are organizing this webinar, which is as part of a project on good and better jobs in India, supported by the Ford Foundation. This is the second phase of the project which we are implementing. So in this project, we are not looking at the employment situation in India per se. What we are doing is to see that how we can have better workers' welfare. What are the conditions necessary for improving workers' welfare in India? Having said that, and before I come to Himanshu, let me say a few things given the context of this webinar. As we all know that growth is important for everybody, for all economies. We know that Indian economy is growing at a fairly good rate, uh, between 5.5 to 6.5, maybe even 7%. Of course, there are some concerns as well about the those rates. But besides that, we need to also see how that growth is impacting our poverty and particularly our income inequality. Therefore, the question that we want to address is while growth is important, unless we're going to face with severe supply side shocks in future, shocks such as which can arise as a result of uh, sudden hike in oil prices or sudden changes in our production system due to climate change and such other factors. I think we are fairly all right in terms of growth. It can vary from 5.5 to 6.5 to 7, but that is all right. And of course, we need more reforms in order to achieve that. At the same time, we need to see whether what are the measures that we can probably take to address inequality. We all know that the inequality, I'm talking about income inequality for the moment. We know that income inequality is increasing in our country, though I have some doubts on its measurement. To me, the simple measurement of income inequality is the difference between GDP per capita and our median income. And if the triennium average of that difference, I'm talking about triennium average so as to even out certain changes. If triennium average of that difference, let's say over the last 3 decades, that is increasing, if the gap is increasing, then definitely we are facing income inequality. And if that gap is increasing at an increasing rate, then the situation is more alarming, so as to say. So I don't know whether somebody has looked at those data. We are trying to do that as part of our work. So let us see what that data tells us. But having said that, hello, I'm on a webinar, I'm sharing. Having said that, let me now come to our panel. And as you know, we have tried to frame a few questions for you, and we're going to have, I'm sure that there'll be other things that you would like to say, but that may come in the second round of deliberations. So let me now request Himanshu for his thoughts in 8 to 10 minutes, particularly on this wealth disparity that we are witnessing in our country, and what kind of measures that you think, Himanshu, to address this issue of wealth disparity, because the kind of disparity that we are seeing today that may challenge our social cohesion other than other things and overall economic development in our country. So over to you, Himanshu, and I would request you to, and other panelists, of course, to stick to 8 to 10 minutes in this first round of deliberations. Thank you, and over to you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so thank you, people, for those introductory remarks. And I think I'll pick up from where you left, in the sense, inequality, I don't think is a standalone phenomena, something which is very much linked to the full process of growth. Inequality is generated in the process of growth. It is not something that is outside the process of growth. While it is definitely a result of what kind of growth we are looking at and who benefits from this growth, who are the people who benefit from, which sections of the population who benefit from this growth. It is also true that inequality is also something which determines how much growth you are likely to have, not just in the medium run, but also in the long. And I think there is a very close link between these. And I think in that sense, what we have seen in the last, what we call as 3 decades of reform, I mean, and we are still talking about more and more reform. I don't know if this word reform has become like forever going on and never ending. But I think what we have seen now is that today our growth is now much more vulnerable to shocks compared to, say, for example, even earlier it used to be, but now it is much more vulnerable to different kind of shocks. And the reason why it is much more vulnerable to shocks is because the drivers of the growth are being, are somewhere the major drivers of growth, among which the major part of the growth driver is the consumer demand. That is something which has been has been under stress for a long period of time. I mean, we are not an economy which are completely dependent on exports. And on the other hand, a large part of our total demand generated in the economy is basically domestic demand, which roughly accounts for around 60% of the total GDP. And inequality in that sense determines what kind of demand will be generated, how will the demand will basically lead to more investment in the economy. And in other words, it is also something which can be broken down into which parts of the economy are creating demand. And I think wealth inequality is only one dimension of it. I would highlight 2 other dimensions of the inequality, which are equally important, and something which I think will come out later in the discussions. The other is the inequality in terms of wages, or for example, earnings of workers in the economy. That is the simplest way of looking at what impact the economy is likely to have, given the increasing inequality in incomes. And that is a gap that has increased. There are no 2 doubts about it. And that is something which is now obvious that India is among the highest, among the countries with a very high level of inequality as far as wage incomes are concerned. The second kind of inequality is an inequality which is normally also called as a horizontal inequality, which is inequality not just in income and wealth dimensions, but inequality in dimensions of education and human development outcomes. Now, these obviously determine, obviously, low level of education is likely to lead to lower income and lower earnings. But the impact of the education inequality, health inequality, nutritional inequality, and several kind of discriminations that are existing in the society, that led to an inequality which is also intergenerational. It is not just the current generation which is affected by lack of access to education, health, and other basic services, but it also affects what is likely to happen as far as the intergenerational mobility is concerned. That is an inequality which is difficult to measure, and it is very difficult to deal with also. But I think that's an inequality which is also very important to deal with. And I think in many ways, our challenge is both ways. I mean, while we may have achieved 7% rate of growth, we might have done economic reforms, we might have become a trillion economy, and whatnot. But as far as the second part of it, which is concerned, our improvements in human development, they are not only low compared to even countries which are of the similar level of income as India, but also huge inequality that exists. These inequalities get exaggerated when you are looking at try and disaggregate the entire population in terms of caste, or for example, gender, or for example, religion or region, and various other dimensions that you can keep on bringing in. And these compound each other. They make it more and more difficult for others to catch up in the long run. And that, I think, is something which is likely to create not just social tensions, political tensions, but more and more demand for redistributive transfers, which we have seen in the last 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, where the only response to rising inequality or rising deprivations or rising marginalization by the governments has been to provide some kind of a dole, whether it is in the form of cash transfers. Earlier, we were providing cash transfers to only those who were out of the labor force population. For example, the elderly, the people who are physically handicapped, and those kind of population is what were basically targeted for providing cash transfers. Now it has become like for everybody. In the sense, women are being given cash transfers, unemployed are being given cash transfers, and we have cash transfer for marriage, to consumption, to investment, to everything that you can think about. But ultimately, what we are looking at is we are basically trying to provide a solution to a symptom, not to the problem. All of these, unemployment, or for example, the distress that is there in the rural economy, where the cash transfers to farmers is being given, or for example, to women, are not the solutions to the problem, because the problem is something that emerges from the nature of production. The nature of production, which basically excludes certain sections of the populations, provides gives more preference or more priority to profit generations and profit accumulation compared to wages being given to workers or workers' protection. And I think unless we attack those ones, unless we raise those fundamental questions which are inherent in the production process itself, the way we are trying to approach is we are basically trying to douse the fire, but we're not looking at why is the fire being generated. What is it that is basically leading to the fire becoming more and more vicious? And I think the social and political tensions are now obvious when people are on the streets. I mean, remember the three dominant agricultural community which we used to take pride of, the Jats, Marathas, and the Patels. They were all on the streets trying to fight for reservations for jobs. Government jobs which doesn't exist. I mean, why go so far back? I mean, look at the whole issue of this Manipur tension that is there. It started from demand for reservation of a particular community in the list of the reserved category. But this is not the solution. The problem is that nobody has the opportunity. People do not have the upward mobility. People do not have access to income. People do not have access to education. People do not have access to health, or for example, other human development, which is constitutional duty of the state to provide for. Unless we tackle those issues as well, along with the monetary metrics, which is income, wages, or for example, wealth that we talked about, we are not likely to have a solution of the inequality being taken care of. And I don't think that governments are even thinking about those issues. In fact, the problem of the current approach to fighting inequality is to, whenever there is a demand, for example, farmers, there is unrest, you provide some kind of a cash transfer to them. The unemployment there, you provide some kind of a cash transfer. The women, there is a problem, you provide some kind of a cash transfer. But nobody is asking as to what is wrong with the basic production structure, which is not just inequalizing in the sense that capitalist takes the larger share of the total value added in the economy, but it is also something which marginalizes, something which excludes, something which basically creates more vulnerability for the population, which is vulnerable. And I think we see that happening in the private sector, and we see that happening by stealth in the public sector as well, in the government sector, through a process of contractualization and informal. And I think those pressures are unlikely to be taken care of unless we take the bull by the horn, which is raise the more fundamental questions. So we see those social and political tensions rising. What is happening in Manipur, what is happening there in terms of violence, in terms of reservation, what are happening in terms of farmers protesting on the street. These are issues which are likely to become more and more serious. They are going to aggravate unless we ask the fundamental questions of tackling income inequality, but also horizontal inequality, also inequality in human development. And I think those issues are not even being talked about. So I must thank you for raising those questions, asking those questions, and having a debate on those questions. I don't think we have a clear-cut answer at this point of time, but simply asking those questions, making it in a public debate, is itself a big contribution to fundamentally raising those issues into political discourse. And I hope it is picked up by in the larger debate on the economy that is currently going on. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Himanshu. Not just for limiting yourself within the 8 to 10 minutes, but for raising some fundamental questions. I know that we do not have answers to them at the moment, but the fundamental question is that we need to go deeper into the structural dimensions of inequality in our production system, in our society, and things like that. And unless we do deep research and then come out with our recommendations, then supported by data, then we may keep going around in anecdotes and in the world of anecdotes, basically, and then keep discussing or deliberating on the same thing in different language. With that, I'll come to some of the points that you have raised in the second round, particularly with respect to horizontal inequality and intergenerational inequality. But I see that both Rituparna and Santosh, they said that they'll be late in joining. So if I may come to Sonal, then I'll come to Gautam. I know that Gautam will have to leave sharp at 7 o'clock. Sonal, you have been coordinating Seva's work. Seva, as we all know, Self-Employment Women's Association, India. Seva's work with informal sector workers uh, at the grassroots. So what do you think that, what kind of specific policies or measures that we need to adopt to improve the job quality? We know that the quality of our jobs is also not good. So what do we do and create more and better opportunities for the Indian workforce for mass production? We have missed the bus several occasions in the past. I don't want to go into that history, but what we need to do now going forward for better opportunities for mass production, particularly for informal workers. Sonal, over to you, and again requesting you to stick to 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
All right. I must apologize in advance for any disturbance. As you can see, I'm in transit. I am at an airport, but I'll try my best to be concise and prevent any disturbances that may come. So I'm really glad I'm going after Himanshu because I do want to build on a couple of things he said, and I do want to address the issue of uh, becoming more vulnerable to shocks. And of course, my entry point is going to be a more gendered one, specifically women, women in work, women in the unorganized sector. But I want to go a step further and talk about women who run their own enterprises, however small or micro, essentially micro entrepreneurs. And often these women are part of a household enterprise, and her work may or may not be visible or registered for that matter. Specifically in India, if you look at uh, enterprises, the smallest category is micro, and and for enterprise to be a micro enterprise, it has to have a turnover of up to a crore, sorry, 5 crores, and investment of up to 1 crore. But if you look at the state of women-run enterprises, and this is of course based out of NSSO data 15-16, over 90% of women-owned enterprises have an annual turnover of only over 10 lakhs. And 50% of all of these women have an annual turnover of only about, at the most, 1 lakh. As you can see, majority of these women are concentrated at the very bottom within a very big bracket. And it's important to say that these women are not a homogeneous group. Their needs and their issues vary, and therefore the solutions for them must also be tailored to their problem. The way Seva has looked at supporting these women is from the lens of building their resilience and then fostering the growth of their enterprises. And when we say resilience, really the idea is that in a state of multiple shocks, their enterprises don't go under, they don't fall back into wage labor and from there into abject poverty. So the idea is for her to stay afloat, to have enough of a buffer, a socioeconomic buffer that helps her run her enterprise. It's not profitably, but at least enough to subsist. For resilience, the idea is to look at a very holistic picture. So to look at access to healthcare, access to childcare, access to microinsurance, access to basic infrastructure services. There's plenty of evidence out there.
Thank you very much for at least highlighting a couple of very important points. One is that our micro entrepreneurs, particularly women entrepreneurs, they are not just micro, they are tiny. So can't we think about the system at the provincial level, at the state level at least, to, I'm talking about an ecosystem, let's say a micro, tiny entrepreneur employing 1 or 2 people as we see in our country. Can't we have a system in place for providing some basic social security needs to take? Why can't there be a debate on that at least? So that is something which is bothering us. And Sonal, I think she was trying to highlight that point. internet issues, you don't speak much. And we'll see, yes, Sonal, you are there. Over to
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. So just want to focus on a couple of these social security factors, whatever comprises the social economic buffer that helps these women stay afloat. One thing I want to really focus on is if you have to promote women's entrepreneurship, you have to support creation and development of women's entrepreneurship incubators, accelerators. These are institutions that do hand-holding support, they do business support services, they do mentoring. And in India, 90% of women's enterprises actually don't have access to formal credit at all. So a dedicated women's enterprise development fund is essential. I'm really sorry for the background noise. Secondly, the gender digital divide. That must be addressed if you want to focus on improving digital literacy. Currently, lots of schemes are only accessible online. So there is an assumption that everyone will have access to a smartphone, everyone will have access to internet, everyone will be digitally literate enough to navigate through that. And that's not working. There's a huge gap there. 30% of women actually in the country use internet as compared to men, which is more than half. 26% of women actually only own smartphones as compared to men who own 49, as compared to 49% of men who own smartphone. Thinking of a solution where you come up with an idea of intermediaries, financial intermediaries such as digi Sakhis or internet Sakhis, who are from the community, who could play the role of that facilitator in helping women access digital platforms, digital devices, to access social security, to promote their businesses, is something that SEWA has been trying. I know a lot of other institutions are, so is the government, but I think there has to be more focus on building the capacity of these digisakhis to begin with. One very important thing I want to focus on is access to childcare. SEWA has been working in the field of childcare. We run our own childcare cooperative in Gujarat, but that's just one cooperative. What we've seen is an increase in consciousness among women that access to childcare has a direct link in their productivity, in the income they make. We of course have a very strong ICDS network, but these Anganwadis, we've spoken to a lot of our members who are all across the country. These Anganwadis are supposed to run for 4 hours. Sometimes they don't even run for 2 hours. They don't have access to drinking water or toilets in the premises. What if we turn the ICDS into a crash facility? What if you, instead of opening it for 4 hours, open it for 8 hours, offer another meal, give a little more compensation to the worker? That's really going to make a big impact. That's 8 hours. That's going to help the women boost their productivity. And productivity, we must not only think in terms of the time saved or income that can increase. It is also about just basically just having a nap, investing on your own well-being. So not everything has to be counted in economic terms, really. But falling back to the access to infrastructure services, I mean access to basic drinking water, toilets, drainage, sewerage, street lights, they've all been linked across multiple trades, be it domestic workers, street vendors, home-based workers, agricultural workers. They all need these access to these services for productivity, for safety, for staying connected to infrastructure. And that's something that we can work on. I just like to sort of end by saying that just by giving a small anecdote from a recent study we did. It was a visual study. We thought there's a lot of focus on digitization, but really, are these women part of that change, or are they being left behind? So we asked some women who had access to smartphones in very urban and rural areas, the young women, to capture what they think is digital for them. And what they came back were, of course, photos of a laptop or a computer or a phone, but also the photo of an electric kettle, an electric iron, a refrigerator, a sewing machine, a washing machine. And really, what we understood from that is, for them, what is digital is not the GEM portal or the Udyam portal, or being able to access services online. It is about productivity. It is about saving time. It is about technological advancements. So there is a need and there is an aspiration, there is an understanding for it, but the gap must be bridged. It's really as much a question of aspiration as it is a question of the infrastructure that they can access to. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonal, for putting your thoughts. I think they are very, very important. They are micro in nature, and we need to see that how those things which are how things are happening on the ground. That is very important. I see that there is, I mean, essentially from what Sonal has said, I see that there is still very much gap, macro micro gap in our policy making itself. Having said that, and I also see that Santosh has joined, so thank you very much. Santosh, I'll come to you. But before that, let me request Gautam. Gautam, given various other challenges, uh, particularly those which are arising in the geopolitical space, can you solely focus on reducing inequality without emphasizing on growth? I know it's a bit tricky question, but I think that we know each other for such a long time. So let's hear your thoughts on this particular question, and of course, any other point that you would like to raise in 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you, Gautam. Over to you.
I don't actually think, thank you for asking me, and thank you asking me to be here, and thank you for framing it in the way you do. I actually don't think there is a dichotomy between growth and inequality. And if I look at the note you circulated, I dare say, and I'm sure that's part of a larger debate, but I think the sort of Kuznets stages of development or curve, as it were, was a dead idea long before Simon Kuznets died his biological death. It's certainly dead it was an idea dead by the collapse of the Bretton Woods in the early 1970s. I do also want to note one thing before I go, I talk about what I want to say, is I think we have to be very careful in addressing the question of inequality from a supply side perspective, especially when we're dealing with the egregious levels of inequality. Supply side neither delivers nor is likely to deliver in the foreseeable future. What it requires is sort of stable macroeconomic policy from very squarely from the demand side. Look, we're a society that's in a way locked in place, where we have an incalculable number of disguised unemployed, i.e. surplus labor, who serve, because of their impoverishment, to drag the wage down and deepen the sort of systemic inequality that we face. And I can see no way forward but to deal with the jobs crisis and to address the wage question. And let me put it this way. About half of India's working population is employed in so-called self-employment. The vast majority of this self-employment are not self-employed by choice. They're self-employed for survival and for want of anything to do. They're not actually engaged in capital accumulation, not even at the margin. They're engaged in self-exploitation, typically living on the margins of subsistence, if not well below it, and bearing the risks that come with being so-called entrepreneurs. I mean, let me just, turn to anybody who knows what the rains in North India and around Delhi have been. If you were the now epifamous tea vendor in our country, in the city of Delhi, you would be drained out. You would have lost 3 days of work for 3 days of work and 3 days of earnings for no cause of yours, but also probably ended up with damaged equipment, so on and so forth. So creating quality jobs lies at the bottom of addressing income inequality. The second of quality jobs, or the core of quality jobs, is a just minimum wage. I think we have sufficient evidence that actually in most states and most employments, the minimum wage bumps around the poverty wage. Every time there's a discussion of raising the minimum wage, there's an enormous backlash that comes in through every possible avenue from large organized employers associations. And the wage more or less stays where it is. Somewhere we need to move on this. Our minimum wage needs to, depending on which state minimum wage it is, to rise between 2 and 3 times. Now, I understand that minimum wage can't be reduced overnight at that scale, but we need to find a way forward. That way forward is perhaps coming to a compact that we will incrementally raise the minimum wage between a 5 or 7 year period. Unless we do that, there's going to be no growth, because the consuming rich are a very small number. How many Rolls Royces can you sell in this economy? Or if I might ask, how many 12 or 1400 cc and upwards cc cars can you sell? If this economy has to grow, to put it in very basic language, we need to consume several times more than the bicycles we consume. We need to consume more, several times the scooters we consume. I mean, nothing brought through it than the pandemic. Two-wheeler sales, 2 years after the pandemic, are still struggling. Luxury cars, the upper-end car sales are booming. What does that tell us about it? What does it tell us about where consumption lies, how limited it is, and actually what the implications of that are in equality? The first speaker spoke about the consumption crisis. In a way, the minimum wage very squarely addresses that crisis. I think with the minimum wage, now the question is where you roll in the minimum wage, how high you set it. Where do you place the cost of public goods, of health, of social security, which I just put down in 4 terms to start: core social security, universal access to health, a pension at 50% of a universal pension at 50% of the minimum wage, maternity compensation, and finally accident compensation for accidents in the workplace. Where are we going to place the costs of this? Is it the exchequer? Is it the employer? Is it a combination of both? Should there be a payroll tax at the highest level of where the economy is taxed? Then there is another set of public goods: education, housing, public transport. Do you build this in the minimum wage, or do you create public provision for these services? The minimum wage is social security plus public goods. That is what makes for a decent living. And this is actually what we need, what we need to address. Let's face it, in every state of this country today, there is violence on the question of jobs. There is violence on the question of admissions to universities. Where does that come from? That comes from the inability to provide jobs. And therefore, intergenerationally advantaged sections of the population are actually breathing down the throat of those historically discriminated, as if they are taking away jobs and university admissions. None of this, of course, is going to happen unless we find a way to regulate capital in whatever limits that we can regulate capital. I'm just holding up this morning's Business Standard view. It says India Inc. may see over 22% profit jump, but it also goes on to say revenues under pressure. What does that tell us? Actually, what the pandemic has done is result in whole-scale profiteering. Let's not forget, in the middle of the pandemic, the single largest private company in this country went debt-free. Let's also not forget the second largest private sector company in this country is very proud to announce its historically ever, in its 120-year history, historically ever dividend.
Sorry, historically?
Highest ever dividend.
Yes.
These, I think, are a reflection of where we are. And I'll end with one thing. You know, employers are obsessed with low wage costs. Let me go to an industry which successive governments have held out as, which will be the panacea of India's export and India's boom, which many of us have been waiting for a lifetime. Real wages in China grow faster than India and significantly faster than India. All said and done, at the end of the day, Chinese textile and garment exports grow several times year on year than India. Real wages of textile workers bump around zero rates of growth. Sometimes there's a marginal rise, sometimes there's a marginal. Tells us something about productivity. It also tells us about something where the country's capitalist class extracts its profit and how it extracts its profit. Capital needs to restructure itself. Capital needs to make itself productive. Capital needs to turn out higher returns on productivity. These are things which I think we need to address as we go down the inequality growth question. Believe me, if we can increase the consumption of two-wheelers by 10 times in the next 5 years, this economy will grow. Believe me, if we can increase the consumption of bicycles by 10 times in the next 5 years, this country will boom. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Gautam. Much food for thought for us. Going forward, I mean, in the first phase of this work, you may remember that when we went to various entrepreneurs, in the textile sector in particular, all these points have come. And it's not that these low wages, they are making our industry more competitive. The other day I was reading a Twitter thread of another friend of ours, Ritesh Singh. He shared the experience of a first-time exporter of textile, by the way, in Mumbai. And the kind of harassment that exporter faced for exporting his product is mindless, as to say. So that explains in a nutshell why we are unable to export much. I'm just talking about that part. And the other point that you have highlighted is this: unless we have a compact that minimum wage is public goods plus social security, or the other way, whatever it is. Social security, some basic social security plus provision of public goods. That is something which we need to work out as part of this work. And let's see how we can take it forward at various levels. So with that, let me now come to Santosh, and I would request him. He's a professor at the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. The questions, I think it follows very nicely from what Gautam has just said, and how limited employment opportunities in the formal sector, they are impacting economic inequality in our country, and what kind of skill development which would require for mass employment generation. We also see that there is this skill gap. So what kind of, I don't think that the supply side efforts in bridging skill gaps, they're going to be much success. They're going to see much success. There has to be generation of demand for such skills, provided those to whom we are asking to have those skills, they think that they're going to get productive employment after acquiring those skills. So over to you, Santosh, for your thoughts in 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vipulda. I'm sorry I joined late. I had a doctor's appointment and I only got home at 5:30. Thank you for inviting me. I've missed Himanshu's intervention. I have missed half of Ms. Sharma's intervention, but I heard all of what Gautam Modi, my good friend, was speaking about, and I agree with almost everything that he said. Let me try and briefly spell out a few things which I believe are a problem with the growth, and then I will come to inequality, and I will try and cover it as quickly as possible. So there's been a structural crisis with growth pre-COVID as well as post-COVID. Let me just outline what the nature of that of the crisis has been. We know that while between 2004 to 14, the economy grew at a historically unprecedented 8% per annum, and we were generating 7.5 million new non-farm jobs per annum during that period. The growth rate has slowed post 2016. And what are the dimensions of that? The 4 dimensions. Let me begin by speaking about those before I return to the subject of equality, jobs, public goods, social security, which are very much part of my what I believe should be this country's agenda. So one of the ways in which slow growth, which we have seen since 2016 on account of the exogenous shocks that were delivered to the economy by motivated action like demonetization and then suddenly poorly planned and badly designed GST, was that the economy was slowing even before COVID. And the result of that was that for 9 quarters before COVID, it was slowing. And then the economy contracted during COVID for 1 year. And the contraction, let's just remind ourselves, was of the order of 6.6% when the world economy contracted by 3.1%. The fact that our economy performed worse is entirely on account of poor policy. I won't have time to refer to that. If you want, I can come back to that later. But all of this was already showing in constrained private final consumption expenditure, which is one driver of growth. PFCE, final consumption expenditure. And why should we be surprised? Because as the economy was slowing, job growth had already slowed, and between 2012 when the total unemployed was 10 million in the economy, the total unemployed by 2019 had already tripled to 30 million, 3 times. And thereafter, during COVID, the number of unemployed grew even further. These are historic highs. So if final consumption expenditure was low, which Gautam was rightly referring to, and it has remained low, it has barely climbed just above the levels of pre-COVID. Why should we be surprised? I'll return to this in a minute. This government, secondly, the second driver of investment is, of course, investment. This government inherited an investment to GDP ratio of 31%. It had been much higher. But before 2014, it was coming down, but at least we were at 31%. So we continued to grow in 15-16 at a reasonable clip. But thanks to the exogenous shocks beginning from 2016, the unorganized sector suffered very severely. The economy was slowing. And one dimension of this was that investment to GDP ratio fell. So for much of this government's period, the investment to GDP ratio has been systematically lower than what it inherited. It had fallen to 26% in FY22. It's only just climbed back up to 29% in FY23. Unlike what Arvind Panagaria has been tom-tomming, it is not 34%. He's reading the numbers wrong, but never mind that. So you cannot create more jobs if investment doesn't revive. And unfortunately, the government is having to take up most of the slack by increasing public investment. The third driver of growth is our exports. You won't believe what I'm about to tell you, and most people somehow don't seem to be familiar with this. This government inherited in 2013-14 merchandise exports at $318 billion. They had already been growing at the rate of 15 to 18% for 25 years. After this government came to power, for every year for 5 years, exports to GDP, which do account for a good 40% of, sorry, so I'll come back to that. Exports actually fell in dollar values. This had never happened since economic reforms began. They bottomed out at $265 billion. I'm talking about merchandise exports. And they only climbed back up to their 13-14 level in 1920. And then, of course, COVID hit, and then they dipped again. So, but for services exports, which we are keeping our growth rate still, at least for exports, okay. The fact of the matter is, exports declining was also bad for jobs. Under the circumstances, why should we be surprised that government expenditure, which is the fourth driver of growth, was already constrained? The government was facing a silent fiscal crisis. And so when COVID came, and the world was actually putting in a massive fiscal stimulus as well as a monetary policy stimulus, this government was at its neoliberal best. When the world had already gone Keynesian, this government was following neoliberalism to the hilt. So that while the emerging market economies on average fiscal stimulus was 4.7% of GDP, in the first year of COVID, our fiscal stimulus was 2.1% of GDP. By contrast, our monetary policy stimulus, our liquidity stimulus, our credit stimulus was several multiples as a proportion of GDP compared to the emerging market economies. What was the result? Later on, massive inflation and our economy contracting in that year on account of the poor fiscal stimulus by, as I said, 2.5 times the global crisis. These are the dimensions of the pre and post-COVID structural economic growth crisis. Under the circumstances, when you have a government which is determined to supposedly create and project national champions as a means of growth, as an instrument of growth, it's hardly surprising that inequality was going to increase. Let me now turn very quickly. I have to say that supply side actions are absolutely critical if we want to increase growth, increase jobs, and thereby hope to reduce inequality. However, you've already seen that in my analysis of the structural economic crisis, I've obviously been speaking about the demand crisis. And the demand crisis obviously is connected to A, the number of non-farm jobs that are being created, that were being created all the way till 2017-18, when we already had a 45-year high of open unemployment, which only worsened thereafter. But in an absence of non-farm jobs growing, we should not expect real wages to rise. So while real wages had been rising consistently because non-farm jobs were growing at 7.5 million per annum between 2004 and 2012, the number of non-farm jobs that were being created between 2013 and 2020, before COVID, fell from 7.5 million to 2.9 million per annum. Under the circumstances, as I argue in a forthcoming piece this week in the Financial Express, real wages either stagnated or they've fallen. Minimum wages is one of the ways forward. Brazil's example in this case has demonstrated it. But in the absence of growth in non-farm jobs, in an economy where 5 to 7 million young people are joining the labor force looking for work every year, in an economy where you already have about 38 million openly unemployed. Thirdly, in an economy where millions are dying to move out of agriculture into non-farm work, we have to, at a minimum, generate 7.5 million non-farm jobs every year. But actually, given this backlog that I have just talked about, we have to generate something like 12 million jobs per annum. For that, we have no choice but to adopt a horizontal industrial policy, not the PLI type of sectoral, capital-intensive industrial policy. Let me turn to the public goods issue, because that's absolute, and because I'm on my last 2 points. I'm already at 11.5 minutes of speaking. I'll finish in the next 3 or 4, I assure you. You know, one of the things that I've demonstrated in recent research, I'd encourage you to look at the EPW September 2021 paper of mine on this issue of public goods, where we argue essentially that human development should precede economic growth. We do it not just on a theoretical model, but we demonstrate it empirically by examining the growth and human development trajectory of the states of India between 1992 and 2018. What we find is the following, that, you know, the divergence in respect of both growth and human development was not very significant until the economic reforms began after 1990. But the divergence actually increased very sharply thereafter. What we also find is that the southern and the western states, I'm making a broad generalization, I could nuance it, I don't have the time. The southern states invested in human development, in health and education, in a way the northern states and the eastern states did not. And that we demonstrate also explains why the growth rate is much higher in the southern and western states, consistently above 7% over a 28-29 year period, while the northern states mostly, I don't have time to nuance what I'm saying, you have to read the paper, grow at about 5 to 5.5%. So what's the conclusion we arrive at? We say that human development should precede economic growth. And the Hindi belt, the Gobar belt states have been particularly remiss in this. Finally, social security was mentioned, it was discussed. You know, we have a panoply, a whole list of things that we do by way of social assistance. We do Manrega, we have PDS, we have the PM Kisan, we have ICDS, we have midday meal schemes, we have a lot. What we don't have is social insurance. What is that? Old age pension, death and disability insurance, maternity benefit. Social insurance is lacking for 91% of our workforce. 91%. That puts us in an Africa category, right? We are rich enough to provide PM Kisan, but only 9% of our workforce has any of those three benefits. I have a whole design of what the architecture, what the cost of this could be, should be. I have a paper on this regard, which is available on the website for Center for Sustainable Employment and on Azim Premji University. We are a rich enough economy, as I demonstrate in that, to actually adopt social insurance for all our workers and provide social security over the next 10 years quite quickly. If we did what I've just been saying, created jobs, invested in the health and education, particularly in the northern and eastern states, and made the effort to extend social insurance to all our informal workers, it will be something which will sustain GDP growth and not lead to a situation where you have volatile growth as we have had over the last 20 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Santosh, for highlighting all these points. Let me now come to Prerna. Prerna works at the Just Jobs Network as a fellow. And Prerna, after hearing all this, unfortunately, someone has to leave. There is due to a medical emergency. But so Prerna will be the last speaker unless Rituparna has joined. So it is a waste problem. We have all heard this. And then after hearing Santosh, it is important for us to understand the non-income aspects of inequality as well. And from your work, I understand that Just Jobs Network is working a lot on not just on income aspects, but also non-income aspects of economic growth, of inequality, and those kind of issues. So how do you see that those non-income aspects, which include gender, caste, regional disparities, which Santosh has touched upon, social opportunities or lack of education, healthcare, how are they affecting India's economic growth, and in turn affecting our inequality in our society? Over to you, Prerna.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chattopadhyay. Am I audible?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting us, and it's been a very engaging discussion till now. So we at the Just Jobs Network work on jobs and labor market issues, and I think where Professor Mehrotra left off is a great point for what I wanted to talk about. And I think, I will primarily be building on things that most of the speakers have already spoken about and addressed. So to begin with, I think I just want to state the obvious, and we all know this, but, inequality is bad for growth, be that income inequality or non-income inequality. But what I wanted to talk about today was how growth is created, what are the policies and what sort of policies and strategies we adopt to achieve growth, and what that means in terms of building resilience in the economy and addressing a lot of non-income inequality aspects, like Mr. Chattopadhyay mentioned. So I think the idea that economic growth will lead to human development and well-being is something that has been debunked already. We know, and we've seen this in India time and time again over the past few decades, that you cannot rely on market forces to correct for inequalities. And, since we work on employment issues, I'm going to speak from that perspective. Now, our work has shown that in a country like India, with very high levels of informality and growing precarity, pursuing growth strategies that are human-centered, that focus on creating good jobs, investing in labor-intensive sectors, is extremely important and needs to be at the forefront of how we pursue growth. Pursuing growth for the purposes of economic growth has not played out for us. In fact, it has arguably led to an increase in inequality. So we really need to focus on understanding and focusing on creating good jobs and investing in sectors that are labor intensive, that will lead to good job creation, which will lead to economic growth as a byproduct, but not an end in itself. So, this is an important point that our research time and time again in the field has highlighted for us. And, that is not to say that economic growth is not important. It is important, but it is important because it provides us the resources, the revenue to actually invest back or invest into human development, invest in well-being, invest in education, in healthcare, as Professor Mehrotra mentioned, in social protection and social security measures, which in an informal economy like India are extremely important to build resilience of the workforce. But the main issue out here is, when it comes to investing in areas that will actually lead to a reduction in inequality on various social measures, is where our priorities are and, how the government actually invests its revenues and resources. We've seen that our budgetary allocation for education is just under 3%, which is extremely low. It should be 6% or higher, keeping in line with global standards. Our health expenditure saw an uptick during COVID, but that was an emergency response measure, not an investment in the long-term health and development of the economy. So we really need to increase our investment in health from 1.2% of the GDP to, as it has been recommended, to 2.5% by 2025. And in the end, to invest in a social security, a social protection infrastructure that allows the workforce to absorb economic shocks without falling back on any gains that have been made, as we saw during COVID. So I think when we talk about inequality and when we talk about economic growth, our viewpoint, our research has constantly shown that we really need to focus on the pathways of growth. We really need to invest in our workforce. We really need to invest in creating good jobs. Only then can we actually have a long-term impact on aspects such as education, as healthcare. Only then can we address regional disparities. Only then can we make some significant progress on gender-related issues as well. I would like to give an example of, we talk a lot about female labor force participation and how to increase female labor force participation. One of the things we time and time again come across in the field is, even when we see an increased participation by women in the workforce, it is usually in low productivity jobs. How do we actually break that cycle? And to break that cycle, we need to focus on strategies that invest in building capacity, building skills of the workforce, enabling access to better quality jobs, and providing a buffer, a security system that allows workers and, as a result, the economy to build long-term resilience that is not in response to a crisis, that is not short-term, that is not reactive. However, instead focus on preventative measures, preventative health, instead of focusing on emergency care. As we do that, as we focus more on human-centered, labor-intensive growth strategies, it will provide us with revenues to invest more in development, more in growth, creating a virtuous cycle and ensuring that economic growth and economies serve our population instead of the other way around, where people are serving economic growth, which is really not the point of growth to begin with.
Thank you, Pranab, for highlighting all these points, which I think are important to understand, to have a holistic understanding of this subject. I see that Rituparna has joined. Ritu, you are the last speaker in this panel. Because someone else-
Apologies for joining in late.
Yeah, Ritu, all said and done after hearing all this, the one point which is coming up again and again. How do we get out of this low level wage trap? Ours, of course, there are unemployment issues in our country, particularly among the youth. But more importantly, we think that we have trapped ourselves into a kind of a low level wage. What are the successful examples that we can draw from other countries? How do you get out of it? That's a simple but tough question for you. Over to you, Ritu.
Thank you so much. So yeah, it's definitely a difficult question, but nonetheless, just to give you perspective that in the last 20 years since we founded Team Lease, I'm just giving you data based on the cohort that we work with. Over the last 20 years, we've given jobs to a little over 2.5 million kids in the country, and I'm just relying on that data. So at that point, the average wage of the what we call the flexi workers, temp workers, I'm leaning on them because they're reflective of the on-ground employment, and especially kids who are trying to make a transition from informal work to work of dignity. So the wage levels at that point of time used to be around 6,500. So today, our average wage of the same cohort of kids who are entering maybe they have some kind of informal job experience here and there, but around that age group of 18 to 25, we're talking about a wage of already 28, 29%. Of course, one might make a case that much of it is because of the natural wage inflation and so on and so forth. But the fact that it has been made possible, it's also an example that when markets start opening up and are receptive to creative economic models, which kind of also kind of triggers economic activity, it's very much possible to do that. I'm also somebody who is not I'm not convinced about any kind of state-funded current prosperity for all as a means of establishing dignity of work, as I believe that it's an act of mere passing on the burden of debt to the future generation and shall become a dagger in the flesh of our kids and grandkids, maybe my daughter, yours, others in the panel. So, but what I do believe that state does have a responsibility, but the state's responsibility essentially, I feel, would be to ensure that all the bottlenecks that today are hindering economic progress, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's in terms of reducing the burden of compliance and cost of compliance, whether in essentially creating a habitat where it's easy to do business, where organizations and companies and enterprises, we know that as against the millions and millions of enterprises which exist in India, how many of them actually have a GST registration? So, but then in India, still it's lucrative for an enterprise to remain a dwarf rather than aim or have an ambition of scaling their business through which they can hire a lot of youth and therein probably kickstart an economic activity which actually has impact on wages. We have made some progress in that direction. You are seeing that certain cities in India where our youth are always at an advantage when it comes to the kind of wage that they command. But the problem is it's inequitable today. Right now, a kid in Bangalore, essentially genetically, because they've chosen Bangalore as their pin code, is going to be whether they have the necessary necessary skills or not, at a better wage, has a command over a better wage premium than, say, somebody who's born in Barmer. And I think these are the things that I feel the state, whether it's at the central level or the state level, we need to start thinking about it. That can we create equitable economic activity? We should not stop at calling it an economic activity of India, because India is different. In India, the challenges are different, and how economic outlook of Karnataka differs from economic outlook of Rajasthan. So I think the state's role, I personally feel, is to kind of create an ecosystem where there is an equitable spread of prosperity. Every state should be able to create themselves as a job magnet. And when I say job, I'm talking about dignified job, quality jobs, which has the command over those kind of wages. Right now, the wage disparity is shocking between the north and the southern part of the country. And that's honestly is happening because there is little or no economic activity in some of these states. Like during the COVID, we saw there was a lot of hue and cry about how the effects of reverse migration and why do we have migration in the first place. But I guess those lessons and promises, unfortunately, have been long forgotten. And I don't see any on-ground work because all those migrant laborers are back to the cities or states where there is prosperity. So I feel that India has made progress, but of course, while our GDP is probably the 5th largest, many claims around that, but in terms of per capita income, we are still 142, which essentially is an area of concern, but it's going to happen largely through a concerted effort to make economic growth and diverse, create the infrastructure, reduce the compliance burden, and create more economic hubs all across the country. And if that happens, and of course, skill is another aspect. I mean, you cannot expect a wage premium until and unless there is a certain level of skill acumen or a productivity level that our youth hits. Without that, it's just going to be an aspiration of someone else taking care of these kids or somebody else funding for them. But that's really not going to help much on the low wage situation that we witnessed today. So I know we are short of time, but because these are some of my remarks, I don't know whether that helps the context or not.
Thank you, Ritu. If I understand your first point correctly, what he was saying that there is a cohort of young people, kids who are entering the job market. In 20 years ago, the average wage was 6,500 rupees, whereas today it is 28,000. That means a CAGR of about 7.5%, which is slightly more than our average annual inflation. So I'm not getting into the details of that, but I have a question for all of you. And there is a specific question for Himanshu, but I think Himanshu is no longer there there's some serious internet issues today due to bad weather. I don't know whether Himanshu is there. I think he has left, but I would pose that question to Santosh in that case. But before that, I have a feeling that whatever employment opportunities, in whatever level, which are being generated in our country, they're getting more and more concentrated in the southern part of our country and in the west coast. A little bit of east coast, of course, but southern part of east coast. Whereas a large number of unemployed are there in our eastern part of the country. So my question to Professor Mehrotra is that how, and of course others, how do we bridge this gap? I think you have partially answered this question in terms of human development and those kind of matters or those kind of things. But over time, we also see the changes in demography. in certain states, population growth is already below the replacement level, whereas employment opportunities are generating there. Specific skills which are required to access those opportunities, they may be there more in the southern and western state, west coast, southern part of east coast. But what about the hinterland? That is something which you need to think, how are you going to bridge this gap? So that's one question for you. And there is another one, but I will come to that later. Over to you, Sandeep.
Okay, thank you, Bikulda. So you're absolutely right. The population growth rate in at least two northern states, Hindi belt states, UP and Bihar, they are the only states where the only two major states in the country where, according to NFHS 5, the latest data, the total fertility rate, meaning the number of children that are born to a woman between the ages of 15 and 49, has still been stuck at 3 in the case of Bihar and 2.5 in the case of UP. When on average, the country has already gotten to a TFR of 2, which is below the replacement rate. And of course, the southern western states have been well below that. And the fact that the southern western states have been well below the 2.1 for several decades already has a lot to do with what I said in my initial remarks, which is the investment in health and education, which the northern Hindi belt, Gobarpatti states have not undertaken. So if we want to get growth at a per capita income level happening in the northern Hindi belt states, this is the biggest investment that they need to make, point one. However, in my presentation, I also spoke about, rather passingly, about industrial policy. We are the only country in the world which is hoping to eliminate poverty without industrializing. Well, it will not happen. Plain and simple, it will not happen. Because there is no country in the world which has sustained poverty reduction as well as experienced sustained GDP growth without manufacturing growth on a sustained basis. Manufacturing contribution to GDP between 1992 and 2015 was a consistent 17%. Now, it did not increase, and I believe it did not increase because we did not adopt and have still not adopted an explicit industrial policy. There was an implicit industrial policy in the 1991 industrial policy statement when the economic reforms began. And that implicit industrial policy was 2 or 3 things. One, we will open up the economy, reduce tariffs. We will invite much greater foreign direct investment on the external side. On the domestic side, we will liberalize and deregulate, and we will de-license any expansion of capacity or creation of new capacity in industries. Fair enough. That was necessary. Those actions were necessary. The third action that was part of that industrial policy statement was that the number of sectors in the economy where the public sector would play a role would be shrunk to 8. And in fact, later it was shrunk to 4. Fair enough, that's also fine. However, despite this action, it's not that we didn't begin to manufacture, but we also reduced tariffs very quickly. So our imports increased very sharply. Our exports grew, but they didn't grow very sharply. I won't go there very much. The bottom line is the fact remains that manufacturing to GDP remained stuck at 17%. Since this government came to power, thanks to its policies, despite all the talk about Make in India, manufacturing contribution to GDP fell systematically. It fell to 13% till 2 years ago, which had never happened post-economic reforms. Never. It's only just climbed back, the economic survey informs us, to 17% in FY23. Simultaneously, manufacturing employment actually fell on account of these government's policies. I could go into that, but as to the reasons for that, we don't have the time to go into that. But let me turn very quickly to finally, because I don't want to take up too much time, to the issue of skills, because you brought it up when I spoke, when I was about to speak, and now you brought it up again. Let me say the following. Skills is a subject that I've been working on for the last 12 to 13 years. Unfortunately, both the previous government as well as the current one, just as the previous government did not have an explicit industrial policy and this government does not. The previous government had a lopsided supply side determined skills policy, and this government has continued that and has not, neither of the two governments ever understood that unless your skills ecosystem evolves on the basis of demand, meaning it has to be a demand-driven system, not a supply-driven system. What do I mean by a supply-driven system? Supply-driven systems are government managed, government financed, and government institutions run the whole ecosystem. I don't have the time to go into this. There has to be a mind shift in the bureaucracy, in the MSD, as well as in the departments, in the skill development missions of the state governments, that unless you bring industry into every dimension of skill development, you are not going to get the kind of skills in the country that we want. I will not elaborate. I could, because I have written at least 10 papers published in national and international journals on this. You can Google those. The bottom line is the following, Vipul. If you don't grow non-farm jobs, don't expect a great deal of demand for skills on the part of young people. And skills will become quality skill provisioning only if industry is engaged. There are ways to do this. I can't elaborate on that. Too little time to do that. Sorry, Bipul. That's about.
Thank you. I would just add to your non-farm jobs, this particular argument. I would add rural non-farm jobs.
Correct, of course.
And whatever you said is in this intervention, that reminds me exactly what is written in Narrow Corridor.
In
Narrow Corridor, Darren Acemoglu. So we need to create a compact, we need to create a movement, if I may use that word, and see to it that how, I think, instead of working at the union level, I think we need to go deeper and work at the state level. It won't be possible for us, or for that matter, anybody, to cover each and every state. So you have to have a coalition of willing to work at various states and then see what we can do. Now, I know that Gautam is to leave, he has to catch a flight to leave sharp at 7 o'clock. So let me pose this question to Gautam, which is posed by a colleague of mine, Ujjwal, that what is the correlation between, and Santosh, this is for you and others as well. What is the correlation between concentration of economy with workers' welfare and job opportunities? Can we say that more the concentrated markets lesser opportunities are there for good and better jobs, which means substandard level fare. So, Gautam, if you can take this question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think concentration of capital definitely results in low wages. There's no ambiguity about that. That said, it does not necessarily mean that concentration of capital should result in low employment or lack of jobs. But when the concentrated section of capital invests excessively in capital-intensive sectors, then you're likely to end up with a situation where, yes, you will have a high degree of joblessness. Now, I think I've heard things this afternoon on giving back, on compliance. We're a capitalist economy. There is no capitalist economy without regulation. And I think perhaps at some point, Cuts should sit down and do an honest review of what kinds of regulation capitalists face in various other countries, both in the global south and the global north. Talking about compliance is actually humbug. The Indian, and excuse me for this, but the Indian capitalist has become like the son-in-law in a traditional Hindu society. He keeps saying, "Give me more." There is no end to it. We unionize in very large numbers in textile and garment, as we do in other sectors. What is happening in textile and garment? Why is it that we don't want to expand? Not because of lack of compliance. The fact is, I have a very simple question. What is the total number of factories that did not close because they had 100 or more employees exclusively, and I'll just zero this down, exclusively in textile and garment in the states of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu? The number is 0. So, we're also a country with a complete breakdown of the rule of law. And I think everybody would recognize when rule of law breaks down, it's the worst off, it's the most unequal that actually bear the brunt of that breakdown of rule of law. So, we're really fishing in the sky saying, oh, I talked to a government supplier. I can bring all the employers who employ our people, the biggest employers in the Indian garment industry, and I can name them. They will all complain. We've had, actually, if I can put it, take this argument one step behind, or take it 40 years behind. There was something known as the Great Textile Strike in 1981. And that was an ideological high watermark for the Indian capitalist class. They decided they wanted to get out of manufacturing and invest in real estate and finance. What we've experienced over these 40 years, just to paraphrase Santosh, the only time manufacturing GDP declined until the recent years was in the late 1970s and the early 80s. What we've actually faced is deindustrialization. What we've actually transformed our industry is into sweatshops. And, I really sort of find when we're looking at egregious levels of inequality in this country, when people talk about giving back, they talk about compliance, I really wonder which world they live in. Because this is about a society's model fiber. It's about a society's model compass. I negotiated a few months ago a contract at a large Indian firm where at the end, a wage contract, where at the end, the vice president HR, who was a little more human than most people around the table, said to me privately that, the pay increase for the 120 workers you negotiated for over a 3-year period is less than the pay increase of our managing director. We're living in a society where some people have decided that they have the right to grab, deprive, and deny. We're a society in profound crisis. We can't just talk policy in the middle of all this, you know? We have to begin addressing moral fiber. And I'd like to stop there because I hope some people in this room will start thinking about those questions. My apologies, I have to leave. I said I'll leave at 7, but my taxi has arrived and the rain in Delhi is very sharp. So I'd rather be safe than sorry. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Gautam. We'll be in touch.
Good
Thank
to
you.
see you, Gautam. Good to see you.
Yeah.
I want
Would you like to add?
very quickly, 2 points, 2 points very quickly. You know, I would point your listeners to a paper by Professor Viral Acharya at the Stern School of Business, recently published a Brookings Institution paper in Washington, D.C., which is very carefully researched. He uses Annual Survey of Industries data, where he demonstrates unmistakably the following 2 trends, which answer to your question before. That in the last 10 years, what we have seen is a very significant increase in the concentration of industry by the top 5 business corporate houses of our country, at the expense of the next 5 and at the expense of the rest. Please remember, we are only talking about listed companies here, meaning the universe to which Viral Acharya is referring is the universe of the listed companies. Now, what are these 5 companies? They are all who you would expect. The Adani Group, the Ambani Group, the Tata Group, the Bharti Mittal Group, and the Aditya Birla Group. Their control over various sectors has grown enormously over the last 10 years compared to the preceding 10 to 15 years. And in each sector, control more and more, and they have also spread widely. So they have grown horizontally, but also concentrated the capital. What is the result of this for pricing? They have their pricing power has increased dramatically on account of their concentration of the concentration of production and of turnover and sales in a whole variety of sectors. They've increased markups and have contributed to a sustained high inflation rate. Isn't that interesting? Point 1. Let me just made my second point much more briefly. You know, your concern in this webinar has been on growth and inequality. What we have seen, particularly post-COVID or during COVID and post-COVID, is that the organized sector has recovered and the unorganized sector, which had really got hammered post-demonetization, which is the one which generates the jobs. Please remember, the unorganized and consists of mostly the MSMEs. Some of the MSMEs are organized, some are not. The bottom line is that the organized has grown at the expense of the unorganized. A phenomenon not dissimilar to what Viral is talking about in the listed sector. And this process has particularly gathered momentum post-demonetization GST. And this has contributed further to the concentration of capital. And my last point, Bipul. Because we don't know the extent of the damage to the unorganized sector in the last 6 to 7 years, the growth rate estimates being put out by the CSO are very suspect. So we are pretending that we are the fastest growing large economy in the world. We've become the 5th largest. But how is this estimated? For our young colleagues, I think it is very important for them to understand that in a highly informalized economy, where the unorganized sector is extremely large, the firms in this unorganized sector are 70% are not registered anywhere. I have a separate paper on this subject, which is about to appear in the Indian Journal of Labor Economics, but its earlier versions are already available on the Azim Premji University's site. You see, if the organized sector is growing at the expense of the unorganized sector, what happens when the CSO estimates GDP for any year? Because we have very little information about the unorganized sector. In each sector, the organized sector's growth is used as a basis for projecting what happened to the unorganized sector. But we don't know what's happening to the unorganized sector. So in other words, what you're getting in the GDP growth numbers is a distorted estimate, which is the reason why you get in the year of the demonetization, believe it or not, the economy did not contract. It grew very well at 8.2%. The government told us. Who would believe that? Can anyone believe that? The best year of growth of this government in 9 years was the year of the demonetization, 16-17, 8.2%. I don't think I need to say more.
Thank you, Santosh. I think we have a very enriching discussion today, and we have made note of all these points, and they will certainly help us in taking forward this initiative on good and better jobs in India. Rituparna and Prerna, do you have any last word? Unfortunately, someone has to leave.
No last words. I think just that sometime back, Santoshji was talking about the points that he raised on need for revitalization of non-farm jobs, especially manufacturing, and the fact that we are falling behind. Definitely, I mean, couldn't agree more. And also the point on skills. I think we somehow are not getting the skill story and the skill narrative right. Yeah, there are different hypotheses, there are different attempts which are being made. But yes, I mean, that's the reason I think, like a broken record, I feel that India needs massification and an explosion of apprenticeship, where industry actually works together in terms of co-creation of the skills, and also the concept of degree apprenticeship needs to be adopted and embedded in every organization, and academia, industry, employers, organizations. I mean, everyone needs to work in cohesion to actually solve for this. So that's it. I don't think I have anything else to add.
Thank you, Ritu. Prerna, do you want to say anything?
No, nothing else to add at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me thank all of you. Also thank my colleagues who have organized this. Many of them are very much involved in this work. So what we are going to do, we are going to first write the proceedings, not in terms of who said what, but more in terms of issues, and then come out with an agenda for further work on these areas. We are going to consult all of you while doing that. Thank you very much, and be safe. Good night.